When we left off with European history last time, we left with the Roman Empire declining and falling. And some of the persons, the invaders that Europe had to face, Europe had to face a lot of foreign invaders. Among them were the Germans, but first of all, I'll talk about the Huns. I've already mentioned them. There have been, throughout history, wave after wave after wave of Mongolians who have come out of Mongolia and spread throughout the east. The Turks, the Bulgars, the Magyars, and the Huns. The Huns were like the first ones, led by a man named Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun goes down along with Genghis Khan as one of the most notorious villains in all of history. Anyway, the Huns were finally defeated. When the Germans and Romans got together and fought a battle against them, the Huns were defeated. Attila believed that he was invincible, believed that he was called by God, whatever God he worshipped. But then when he learned he was about to be defeated, he just simply crouched up and was about to commit suicide when someone told him, hey, there's a big hole in the line, in the enemy's line, and your army can get out. What it was, the Roman general deliberately left a route for Attila to retreat because he was hoping he could side with Attila to defeat the Germans. So he managed to deliberately let the Huns get loose and get off. The general who let him loose never did really defeat the Germans, but that was at least his hope, his goal. Anyway, now the other groups we'll talk about were Germans, the Vandals, the Angles, the Saxon Jutes. From this we get to the word vandalism. The Vandals actually went in and sacked Rome. It was the first time that had happened in 800 years. But they sacked Rome, and it happened in 410 CE. Don't worry about the date. But this was something that really upset the world, and St. Augustine wrote about it. And he wrote a book called City of God, in which he said that, well, the city on earth has been defeated, but there's a city of God that will still stand. And also, St. Augustine told the world it was not Christianity's fault that the Vandals had sacked Rome, that it simply was something that happens in the course of history. The Angles, they went to England, and where we get the name Angleland. Now there were three groups, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. These are all three Germanic tribes that went to England. And we sometimes refer to the English people as Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxons, they went in, took over from the Britons. Now the original inhabitants of England had been the Britons. The Britons fled to Wales and a place in France called Brittany. Now, during the time that the Germans were moving in, it took a few generations, and in fact, there was, during this time, a 40-year period in which no German tribe moved into England. But during this time, supposedly a certain king stopped them. This king was King Arthur. Now, if you research King Arthur as much as I have, you'll read that perhaps King Arthur never even existed. Unfortunately, the earliest writings we have about King Arthur were written 300 years after he would have lived. He would have lived around 500 CE, and the earliest writing we have around 800. The stories about him are contradictory, and we simply do not know how much of what they said about him we can believe. And of course, a lot of the stories surrounding King Arthur involve events that are simply supernatural. And when I was in high school, I checked out a book from the library about King Arthur, and in the front pages, the author of the book opened up and said, any modern reader is going to wonder, how much of this can I believe? And then he tried to give rational explanations. Now, in those days, throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they felt like they had to give rational explanations for every supernatural event. Today, I mean, we have stories like Harry Potter or even Dark Shadows that came along in the late 1960s where they don't even try to give rational explanations for supernatural events, they just accept them. But anyway, the story of Arthur, supposedly he kept the Germans from coming in for the next 40 or so years, but inevitably they came in anyway. Now, I just want to curious, how many of you have read about King Arthur and the Knights of Round Table? You know, one of you, two of you, Sir Lancelot and his crush on Guinevere that wound up bringing down the king's whole army and leading to German invaders coming in droves. And actually, in modern times, Kennedy's administration was compared to King Lot. Kennedy, King Lot, that you had a king and a queen and a bunch of knights oftentimes behaving in a way they should not have. And then again, but there's a comparison there. But anyway, the Anglo-Saxon Jews came in, settled in England. There also were the Goths. Oh yes, something else, and this was on the final exam. I mean, Arthur, according to the story, became king after he pulled a sword that nobody else was able to pull. Now, folk, all right, I'm going to tell this anyway, because this is when this was the most famous story to come out of the Middle Ages, the story about Arthur. And these were stories that these people told before the invention of television, before the invention of movies, when the theater did not exist in the Middle Ages, because the church frowned on theatrics. And folk, in all justification of the church, if you look at the personal lives of most actors and actresses, you can understand why. And this has been true all the way down through the ages. I mean, who knows? The man who shot Lincoln, what profession was he? Anybody know? The man who shot Lincoln, he was an actor. John Wilkes Booth. He was a famous actor, and his brother was a little bit more famous than he was, Edwin Booth. Both of them are actors. Edwin was not involved in the plot, but the personal lives of actors and actresses have left a lot to be desired. And this led the medieval church to ban the theater. Not that they necessarily should have, but they did. But these people then would get around at campfires and tell stories. The story of Arthur really begins with his father. His father had an advisor named Merlin. Merlin, all right. Folk, I'm going to tell you the story the way they tell it, the way they told it. Supposedly, Merlin's father was a fallen angel. I mean, this is I believe, the last case in history where the folklore has some fallen angel cohabiting with an earth woman. And Merlin's father was a fallen angel. And when the devil realized that this woman was about to bear Merlin, the devil thought, oh, I've got my Antichrist here. Well, instead, Merlin's mother went to church regularly and attended confessionals regularly and attended the sacraments. So Merlin, instead of becoming a wicked person, became a Christian magician, and he was active in the court of Arthur's father. Arthur's father was named Uther. Anyway, when Uther died, Merlin knew that Uther had a son, a baby son. Well, anyway, Merlin gave his baby son to one of the king's nobles and said, raise him up, and at the time I'll call for him. You'll know when it's time to give him up. Didn't tell him that he was really the king's son. So this person, Sir Kay, raised up the baby Arthur. And Merlin then wedged a sword to stone and said, whoever can pull this sword out is the rightful king of England. Well, 15 years went by. Nobody could pull the sword. Well, one day, they were having a big party. The party was in a clearing not far from the churchyard. And Arthur's older brother, Sir Kay, had just been knighted. And he got to the party and realized he'd forgotten his sword. And this was a disgrace for a knight to be in public without a sword. So the father said to young Arthur, go home and fetch your brother's sword. And Arthur thought, oh no, what bad luck. Then Arthur remembered, hey, there's this sword sitting in a stone in a churchyard. And after all, hadn't he heard that anything on church property belonged to everybody as long as he put it back when he was through with it? So instead of going home, he went to the churchyard, pulled a sword out of the stone, Then, because, you know, the only safe way to carry a sword is to hold it high in the air, and young Arthur then held the sword high in the air and ran pell-mell back to the party with the sword high in the air. He didn't know he was about to crash the party. When he got to the party, the clearer the party was, he didn't notice everybody who saw him started grabbing everybody's attention. Hey, look at that, look at that. They all thought that he had announced that he was the King of England. I mean, they all recognized the sword for what it was. Nothing could have been farther from the truth. Arthur didn't notice that the people at the party started following him. He didn't notice anything that was out of the ordinary until he got to his father. Thought, son, where did you get this? Really, Dad, I'll put it back. Nobody will miss it. Nobody will. Son, did you pull the sword out of the stone in the churchyard? At this point, Arthur could see that the whole crowd, high-born and low-born, were surrounding him, getting around him. And he realized whatever he had done, it had stopped the whole party. Well, the party moved itself back to the church, and they wedged the sword back in the stone again. Some of the strongest men in the kingdom tried to pull the sword out. None of them could. Then they let Arthur try his hand. Arthur, according to the count, pulled the sword easily with one hand. They did this experiment several times, and after a while they realized, hey, there's some real magic going on. And they also, apparently England has found a small lost king. Well, Sir Rector had a talk with young Arthur and said, Arthur, I got something to tell you. I am not really your father. I never was. Merlin gave you to me when you were a baby. Now I know who your real father is. I said, well, who is my real father? Your real father is none other than the former king Arthur Pendragon. Well, they began to prepare for a coronation. They moved Arthur and his family into the palace of Camelot, and Arthur became the most famous king England ever had. Again, as to how much of this story you can believe, it will depend on your worldview. But I want to remind you, folks, every ancient peoples begin their histories with stories similar to this. Stories that involve the supernatural, you might even say the occult. Anyway, Arthur became king. He stopped the German advance for possibly up to 40 years. Anyway, back to the Goths. They were divided into two groups, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. The Ostrogoths moved into Italy. The Visigoths moved into Spain. A lot of your Spanish today are descended from the Visigoths. Well, unfortunately, the Visigoths were unable to keep the Muslims out, so the Muslims took over a large portion of Spain and held it for some 700 or 800 years. As for the Ostrogoths, they took over Italy, and they largely replaced the the Roman population until there were no Romans anymore. Latin fell from disuse, except in church services. And Italian took over. The Italian language is a lot like Latin. Europe was to become divided into two major language groups, the Latin and the Germanic. English, by the way, is a Germanic language. Germanic includes German, and then, of course, there are other German and English. There are other language groups also. But French is considered a Latin language. Portuguese, also a Latin language. Now, all this was changing the demographic scene of Europe. What was happening to the Romans? They had become extinct again due to lack of repopulating themselves. And a new group, the Germans, took over. Well, time went on. A new group came along called the Franks. From the word Franks, we get our word France. The word France is a corruption of Franks. The Franks moved in and settled in Gaul, and what is today France, and they gave their name now to the French. The first important king of the Franks was Clovis. Clovis's great-grandfather was named Merovingian, so Clovis was of the Merovingian dynasty. Now, folk, if any of you ever read any book about conspiracy, you will run into these Merovingians. The Merovingian dynasty, this name Mary, supposedly comes from Mary Magdalene. They were named that. Now, I'm not saying this is any way true, but it is important because a lot of persons believe that a lot of European history can be explained by attempts to restore the Merovingian dynasty after it fell. Anyway, the Merovingian dynasty believed that they were descended from Mary Magdalene, which means that they actually believed that Mary Magdalene married Jesus, or at least Jesus' brother James, and that the family fled to France after Jesus' crucifixion. And from France, they eventually rose up and took over. Now, folk, in no way do I believe we're expound this. Nevertheless, this is what they believed. The Merovingian dynasty believed that they were descended from Jesus' brothers, at least, James particularly, and that meant they were descended from David and Solomon. They spent a lot of their time reading the Psalms and the Proverbs. They spent a lot of time reading about David and Solomon. And here's where they made their huge mistake. To keep their bloodline pure, they only married within their family. In other words, they only married like their first and second cousins. The result was it became inbred. Now, Clovis himself was strong and healthy. His father had been even stronger than he was, but after Clovis, you don't have a strong Merovingian king. Typically, Merovingian kings, they'd be born to a teenage father. They'd only live about 21 years. They'd get married about 15. And they'd be dead by 21, and they'd leave the throne to a 5 or 6 year old son. So typically, a Merovingian king, he'd be born to a teenage father. His father would die when his father was only 20, and he was about 6. So he'd become king at 6 years old. And he himself then would die and leave the throne to another 6-year-old child. And then basically, they were child kings. And eventually, the line became extinct. And again, the problem was inbreeding, and this was a problem that royalty was to have all the way down through until the last. Well, there are a few European royals left. Even though we'll say this today, the royal families in Britain particularly have enough sense to marry outside their royal family. And in fact, the next Prince of Wales is married to a commoner, not even marriage nobility. This is probably going to be good for the family's genes. Maybe not always great socially, but good for their genes. Again, they were inbred. So much of European royalty was inbred, and the English and Russians tend to intermarry, with the result that the Russians kings had all kinds of physical and mental deficiencies. And a lot of British kings and queens had the same thing. King George III was weak mentally. He was inbred. The last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was inbred. He was also weak mentally. A lot of your kings had this problem. When the Merovingian dynasty was finally shelved, put aside, there have been attempts all the way down through the ages to restore them, because it's believed that they are the rightful heirs to the Roman Empire, and that they are descended either from Jesus or one of his brothers. Okay, I want to comment on that, folk. I mean, I had to talk with the first cousin who's in genealogy, and she said that our family is descended from Charlemagne. Is it possible? I mean, but she can't prove the exact line of descent. It's highly likely. Here's why. Charlemagne had a couple of sons, and each of those, in turn, several of those had more sons. All right. If someone were to offer you $1 million outright, or offer you a penny today and double that tomorrow and double that and double that and double that for 30 days, which would you take? The penny doubled every day for 30 days with $1 million outright? How many of you know? You'd take the penny. I would take the penny. At the end of 30 days, you'd wind up with $2 million. If you don't know how to do it, you get a computer and double 1 cent, 2 cents, 4 cents, 8, 16, 32, 64. Oh, the first 10 days you'd starve. At the end of day 10, you'd only have $10, but then that would be 20, 40, 80, 160. At the end of 20 days, you'd have about $10,000. On day 30, you'd get 1 million, but then you'd have gotten 1 million the days before, so that'd be $2 million. What does that do with history? Quite a bit. It means that you have two parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, which means that everybody who has any European descent in him at all, and I do, is probably descended from all the people we're talking about. Charlemagne, am I descended from Charlemagne? Highly likely, because most everybody alive today in Europe who is probably descended from Charlemagne. Again, as well as a whole bunch of common people, as well as a whole bunch of unsuccessful people. Charlemagne's great-great and great-great-grandchildren, eventually some of them lost the fact that they were descended from royalty, and they became nothing but poor commoners. Again, if you've read the funny papers, they sometimes feature a character called the Phantom. And in a story about the Phantom, he would have one child, one son, and one son. Each of them had one son. This went over 400 years. Folks, this is a physical impossibility. For one thing, half of the babies you have are going to be girls. And for another, most couples wind up having more than one child. But for another, a lot of times you'll have a son who's just not capable of taking on his father's footsteps, or doesn't want to be what his father was. But they had one son, and this son all looked like his father, where the local people believed that he was the same man who had lived for 400 years. Again, this is a physical impossibility. So, could the Merovingians be descended from Jesus' brother? Possibly, but if so, that means every European alive today is descended from him. Because these men are known to have had more than one child. A lot of them, the ones who had children, had more than one. Anyway, but there have been attempts made to restore the Merovingian dynasty, and again, if you're into conspiracies, the last major attempt was World War I itself. This is alternate history, but the World War I was an attempt made to restore the Merovingian dynasty. It failed. Who is the Merovingian alive? That's kept secret. If there's any Merovingians still alive, that's kept super secret who they are. I'll say, keep that, because I'm going to be saying more about the Merovingians in the days ahead, particularly when it comes to the Knights Templar. They claimed that they were descended from the Merovingians also. Have any of you heard of the Templars? Nobody? I'll be talking about it before the semester is out. But anyway, keep them in mind. But anyway, Clovis, now here's what's significant about Clovis, and this much is in your book. Clovis was the first king in Europe to be baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. You might say, I thought Constantine was. Well, Constantine was an Arian Christian. There was a difference. Constantine was Arian, but Clovis was the first one to become a Roman Catholic. Now, why did Clovis convert to Christianity? I mean, Clovis was born a pagan. I mean, you might think if they believed they were descended from Mary that they were, but actually Clovis was born a pagan, as was his father. His father lived and died a pagan, and so did his grandfather, and probably his great-grandfather too. Well, I have a book at home, the book we used, that said that Clovis had all kinds of reasons for becoming a Christian. Number one, his wife was a Christian already. His children were being brought up in a church. If that weren't enough, most of the generals in his army were Christians. His top advisor was a Christian. And the kingdom was fast becoming Christian and leaving paganism. So he became a Christian himself. And then he began conquering his neighbors in the name of Christianity, or in the name of Jesus. This is very important because, folks, this is one reason why Europe became Christian and other countries didn't. Christian missionaries coming from Europe were never able to convert Mongolian royalty or Chinese royalty, and it's believed by some scholars that if Christian missionaries had sent their princes, crown princes, or sent some of their princes over to talk to the leaders, the royalty of China and Mongolia and Vietnam and Japan, the history of the world might have been different. These places might have converted to Christianity. Be that as it may, they didn't, but Europe was the only place on earth that converted its royalty to Christianity. As a result, Europe became at least nominally Christian. Frankish kings also had another problem they eventually solved. They would divide their kingdom among all their sons. Well, Clovis, when he died, he divided his kingdom among about 3 or 4 sons. The result was the kingdoms kept splintering and splintering and getting smaller and smaller. Eventually, another king, a different family, was able to unite France once again, but France was splintered. And this, of course, now what happened eventually was that the nobility of Europe and the kings of Europe learned when the father dies, only the oldest son becomes a noble, and the other sons become knights. When the king dies, only the oldest son becomes king, and the other sons become counts and earls or dukes or whatever. But they eventually learned they could not split up their kingdom into smaller parts, so the kingdom would become so fragmented that then these kings would start warring with each other. But Clovis had his kings, had his kingdom divided up among his sons. We're going to leave the Merovingians for a while and talk about what life was like among the Germanic peoples. And the tribal German peoples, the family played a big role in your life. You were born into a family. It was not only your immediate family, but also your extended family. You might say the tribe. And here's the justice system. If you hurt a member of another family, you could expect that family to come after you. Now this went on down through the hundreds of years where the families would start feuding. The more famous feud was the feud between the Montagues and Capulets. If you read the story Romeo and Juliet, this was a family feud that had gone on for maybe 100 years and nobody even knew what started it. In American history, we had a feud between the Hatfields and McCoys that wound up killing several Hatfield McCoys. Today, the Hatfields McCoys meet at a party once a year, and they relive their differences, but they no longer fight. The fighting has ended. But they fought for several generations over we don't even know. I don't even think they even know what it was over about now. In my own personal history, the Cunningham family fought the Montgomery family for generations, and the King of Scotland was helpless to stop it. And at one point, some Montgomerys killed about 5 Cunninghams, waylaid them in a forest and killed them, and then the Cunninghams in turn retaliated and killed a bunch of Montgomerys. This went on for several generations, and again, these family feuds would start. Now, the Romans had said that when somebody commits a crime, it's up to the state to come and take vengeance, and not up to the families. The Germans were a setback from that system, and they believed that families should play a role in administering justice. I want to say this, folks. All right, from our point of view, we like the Roman system better, where that if you commit a crime, it's up to the state. But there are persons who believe that there'd be less crime if you kill a member of a family, if the member of the family was allowed to pull the switch that would execute you or execute somebody. A lot of people believe that there'd be less crime this way because people were afraid of families more than they were afraid of the state. With the state, too many criminals get off. Some technicality. With families, nobody got off. Be that as it may, mankind goes back and forth trying to set up a system that's good, perfect, and just. Eventually, paganism has a strong emphasis on revenge. Revenge and honor, and again, these people were initially pagan. Eventually, a system called a weregild replaced revenge. A weregild was a fine. Now, if you hurt a member of another family, your family had to pay a weregild to the offended family, and this did a lot to keep down a lot of the fights between families. The fine called a weregild. They also had a system called compurgation. Essentially, you got a group of people together to swear to a person's innocence. So if you were accused, if you could collect enough people together to go to court and get these people to say, I know something about the crime, or I was with this person did not do it. If you get enough people to swear an oath of innocence, then this person was to be declared not guilty. Now, there's another one that might seem strange to us at first, trial by ordeal. Ordeal is where you had the accused undergo some painful ordeal to see if he healed quickly. It might be lying on a bed of hot coals, or walking on spikes, or walking on a bed of hot coals, or walking on a hot iron, or lying on a bed of spikes. And they would examine your body after you got up from, let's say it was spikes, they would examine your body after you got up from the spikes to determine how quickly you healed. Now, folks, before you think this sounds completely silly, a lot of medical professionals today believe that a guilty person would not heal as fast as innocent. The guilt makes a person more prone to illness, more prone to disease, more prone to cancer, feelings of guilt. Guilty people oftentimes lead shorter lives, especially if they feel the guilt. And again, less likely to heal, whereas an innocent person could relax more on a bed of spikes, which would mean that the spikes would not penetrate his body as deeply, and would be likely to heal more quickly than he otherwise would. Now, we do a little bit of the same thing. I mean, comparing their time with ours, we have a test called a lie detector, which is no longer admissible in court, but it was in my day. But actually, I say it's no longer admissible in court, but a fellow employee of mine at Lockheed went to prison for a couple of years, based largely on the results of a polygraph test. Essentially, the polygraph works in such a way that if you ask a question about something you don't want known, your blood pressure is going to change. The problem with it is some people lie so much and so often that they can actually fool the polygraph, because they have lied so much that they can lie without their blood pressure changing. They can even lie to it. Yes?
It's not used in court anymore.
Say a little louder, please.
It's not admissible in court, like you can't use it in court.
You can't use it in court anymore, even though I say you can't.
They still use it, but they don't like.
They don't convict you on it based on it, but the testimony is admissible in a court of law. And in a lot of cases, juries will be swayed by the results of a polygraph. Yes?
It's also easily manipulated, not by just the fact that you can lie, but you can control your blood pressure. Because what they did, it was like 30-something years ago, I think, they found out that a lot of the people that were actually undergoing the test would keep a thumbtack in their shoe. And when they press their toe down on the thumbtack, and that lowers your blood pressure. Because
I didn't know that. I have heard if you do without sleep for 30 or 40 hours before the lie detector, that the sheer fatigue of your body will keep your blood pressure from changing. Yes?
Also, they didn't really use it because you could be nervous. Some people have that anxiety.
A lot of people, and I'm afraid that would be my case, that I would have my blood pressure change in a lot of cases when I was even telling the truth. I mean, I suspected. But in other words, it can be fooled. But again, like this trial by ordeal, while it was not foolproof, it might have had some validity in some cases. All right, anyway, like I say, it helped get a man that I worked with at Lockheed put in prison for a couple of years. And I mean, he was talking to me about it big time. Then all of a sudden he took the polygraph and missed 6 days of work in a row. He never did tell me the results of the polygraph. Someone else finally told me after he quit work entirely, and then I learned he was in prison. But then we were slow at learning that. But anyway, part of it was due to the results of the polygraph. All right, but that's something else. Christianity. Now, during this time in Rome and Europe's history, Christianity made a lot of advances, not just in a spiritual front, but on a political front. As political power declined, and when the emperor went to live in Constantinople and left a power vacuum in Europe, barbaric tribes moved all over Europe, and Europe was helpless to stop them. These barbarians settled in. The one strong man of the hour was the Bishop of Rome. Today we know him as a pope. Now our present pope, when he took over, said, I'm not going to forget that I'm first and foremost Bishop of Rome and secondly pope. But a lot of popes seem to have forgotten that they were once bishops of Rome. But for 400 years, your popes had the title of Bishop of Rome, and they were not really in charge of the whole church. But the pope's power increased. And the church began to take on functions that formerly had been taken over by the state. The church began to perform marriage ceremonies, and folks, this is still a lot the case today. A lot of couples do not consider themselves married until they've had a wedding by the church. Now, they'll go to the courthouse and get a marriage license, but they don't consider themselves married until they've had a wedding ceremony put on by the church. This was in my case too. I mean, my wife and I went to courthouse several days before our wedding, got a marriage license, but we did not consider ourselves married until after the wedding day itself, which occurred at church. The church then began to determine who was married and who wasn't. The church began to organize itself after the pattern of Rome, and a lot of churches still do this. I mean, you'll have the church denomination in Alabama, another church in Georgia. I mean, but they began to organize themselves. They had the priest, the local parish priest was at the bottom. Above the priest was the bishop. And then eventually there came the office of archbishop and cardinal and pope. No, the bishops at Rome were not at first looked on as being popes. This was a long, slow development. But eventually there came the office of archbishop. Again, organized after the same way that the political states had been organized during the days of the Roman Empire. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome began to claim more and more authority, and he began to claim that he took the place of the Caesar when the Caesar left. And this led to the office of Pope. There's some controversy as to who was the first Pope. Again, one thing that elevated the status of the Pope was when Pope Leo went out and talked to Attila the Hun and supposedly persuaded Attila the Hun not to attack Rome. All right, well, there's no doubt that the Pope went out and talked to Attila, but there's several reasons why Attila would want to leave. Number one, Attila had just learned that the emperor was just across the Adriatic Sea, and all he do is get on a bunch of ships and cross over. So the emperor was after him. Then the general who had defeated him was crossing the Alps mountains, and Attila ran the risk of being trapped in the peninsula of Italy. If that were not enough, winter was coming on, and winter meant diseases. That Attila was afraid that plague would break out in his army. If his army were found in camps, he wanted to get his army in their houses where they could better survive the winter. All this might have figured into Attila's decision. Nevertheless, when Attila passed by Rome, Leo went out and talked to him, and according to the account, Peter and Paul appeared with flaming swords and said they would burn Attila up if he didn't do what the Pope said. Now, this part of the story I do not believe, but nevertheless, this word passed. But the stature of the Pope was greatly enhanced because it made the Pope look bold and brave, to where he'd even stand up to Attila. Eventually, the church asserted more and more power that had once been reserved for the states. The church set up their own courts, established their own justice system. They heard disputes, tried disputes. Eventually the church got to work at appoint the successors to nobles, carry out the wills of the people who died. They became entrusted with a whole lot of authority. And the church became very powerful, and this power was to last for 1,000 or so years. The most famous pope of this time period was Pope Gregory I, or otherwise known as Gregory the Great. Now, Pope Gregory, it has been said if all the popes would have been like him, there would have been no Protestant Reformation. We'd all be Roman Catholic today. He helped the poor, which I won't condemn him for, because, I mean, you've heard me say, helping the poor is not a job for the government. However, I won't go so far as to say it's not a job for the church. But he helped the poor. He also set up the Gregorian calendar, which we still use to this day. It was found that Pope Gregory lived in the 500s. Well, up until this time, Europe had used the Julian calendar. But it was found that the Julian calendar was off by a few days every, maybe 1 or 2 days a century. Actually, about 3 or 4 days a century. Well, after about 500 years, the Gregorian calendar was getting to be about 20 days off, 15 to 20 days off from where it should have been. And they realized if they weren't careful, they'd have a Gregorian calendar. I mean, the Julian calendar would be, we'd be singing "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas" when the temperature outside was 100 degrees. The seasons would become completely twisted and inverted around. So the Gregorian calendar was designed to keep December in the cold month, to keep the equinoxes and the solstices occurring approximately the same day. And it added leap years. Every 4 years is a leap year, except the years that are not the years at the end of a century. In other words, the years 1700, 1800, 1900 were not leap years. The year 2000 was. If the century is divisible 400, it's a leap year. If the century is not, so even though the year 2000 was a leap year, if any of you live to the year 2100, it will not be a leap year. 2200. The Gregorian calendar is expected to last 10,000 years. At that time, we'll either have to add or subtract a day. I don't know which, but by that time we might have to add a day somewhere to the Gregorian calendar. But it was set up by Pope Gregory. He set up the Papal States, which if you look on the old maps of Europe, the Papal States were to last until 1870. And they were to become a big part of Italy's politics. Now this is something, folk, I really think he should not have done. But basically the Pope became a king of sorts over a country with secular power, which today we do not allow our popes to do. Yes? Say again louder. The Papal States, they were a group of counties around the city of Rome that when Italy was divided, after the fall, when Italy was divided, and there was Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Kingdom of Venus, the Kingdom of Genoa, and in the middle there all was the Papal States. These kingdoms would, the boundaries would change every generation as one king would conquer another. Naples would sometimes make headway against the Papal States. The Pope then became like another European prince. He would make treaties, field armies, and wage wars like a European prince. He basically was the head of a nation. But the Papal States was the area around Rome. Its boundaries varied again with every generation. They sometimes take territory by war, and sometimes by treaty, and sometimes by marriage alliances. It is known that the first 400 years, the bishops of Rome, a lot of them, the men who held the office were married, and sometimes the bishop would actually have his son inserted into office after he died. The idea that the bishop should be celibate did not come until after the 400s. Monasteries were set up, and these were to become a big part of European life. The monasteries, folks, served as several things at once. They served as hospitals, libraries, meeting halls, town halls, you might say, several functions. And they were a big part of the European scene. You might even say it sometimes even served as mental institutions, with all due respect, but the people who had relatives who they could not care for any longer would take these relatives to a monastery, and the people inside the monastery would care for them. The men living in the monasteries were called monks. Now, the monasteries for men, the convents were for women. The women living in the convents were called nuns. The head of a monastery was an abbot. The head of a convent was often called Mother Superior. That's what she's called now. I don't know what they were called then. The monks and nuns took 3 vows. And folk, I'll always remember this because I missed it on the test one time. I thought, oh, this is easy. It came test time to fill in a blank test, and I couldn't remember them all. But the 3 vows they took were poverty, chastity, and obedience. Obedience. Poverty, they would never own anything. All the property they'd give to the monastery, and the monastery would own. Chastity, they would never engage in sex or live a life of celibate, never marry. Obedience, they would always obey the orders from their abbot or their mother superior, whatever the case may be. They took 3 vows. They were kept busy constantly. Now, and one of the things I mentioned, they were like the libraries. They copied the ancient manuscripts, and with a lot of what we know about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, is what the monks copied. The monks took Tacitus, for instance, and they copied. They copied the Bible. And they copied the Bible, the works from the ancient philosophers, so that much of what we know about Western Europe, the reason we know as much as we do about Greece, for instance, is the monks copied it. Now you might wonder, what about the other places besides Greece and Rome? Well, monks did not copy their writings. That's why a lot of their works have been lost. But in the case of Greece, we know what Socrates believed. We have some idea because the monks copied Thucydides, Xenophon, Plato, a lot of the Greek writers, Plutarch. And, the monks copied these people. Livy. Again, this is why we got to have a lot of the history we have from the ancient times. All right. The greatest king in this period of time, and this one really existed, was Charlemagne. Charlemagne was not of the Merovingian, he was like the Carolingian dynasty, but backing up a little bit. Charlemagne's grandfather was Charles Martel. Charles Martel was merely what they called the big man of the palace, or the mayor of the palace, the mayor of the palace. The king was a weak, childlike Merovingian. But Charles Martel was remembered because he was the one who defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. I've talked about it before. I mean, he was the one who, and this enhanced the prestige of the mayors of the palace. He defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours and stopped the Muslim advance into France. And eventually Europe was able to drive the Muslims out of Spain. Charles Martel had a son named Pepin. Pepin decided that he should be king. He said these Merovingian kings are children. So Pepin wrote a letter to the Pope. And the Pope approved of Pepin's choice. So the people of Pepin's day raised him up on a shield. Pepin was a little man, known as Pepin the Short, or Pepin the Brief. Pepin the Brief, which in French means Pepin the Short. They raised Pepin up on their shields and put the last Merovingian king in a monastery where he supposedly died there. And supposedly the Merovingian dynasty died out. However, there are persons who dispute that. But anyway, Pepin took over and became king. Now the word Charlemagne means Charles the Great. Well, Charles Martel, that's Charles the Hammer. Pepin the Short, these French kings at this point were giving names to their kings. And some of them got bad names like Charles the Simple, Charles the Bald, Charles the Fat. Yeah, there was one of the kings called Charles the Simple. Yes, Charles the Bald, Charles the Fat. But yeah, so many of your French kings went by the name of Louis and Charles. But anyway, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, he was the greatest king of his time. Charlemagne's empire included what is today France and Germany and northern Italy. He got northern Italy. Now, in the year 800 on Christmas Day, Charlemagne was down in Rome, and the Pope surprised him by slipping a crown on his head. The Pope said, "Hey, Your Majesty, kneel down." And Charlemagne kneeled before the Pope, and the Pope placed a crown on his head and said, "Arise, Roman Emperor." Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor, and it was the first time that the title of Roman Emperor had been given to a non-Roman, a Frank. Now, some people believe that this was the beginning of the office of Holy Roman Empire, which was to last for another 1,000 years. in 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte abolished the title Holy Roman Empire. But it was the church's attempt to revive the old Roman Empire, and Charlemagne was almost qualified to be called Roman Emperor, except that his kingdom included a lot of territory that had not been in the original Rome, and it never was as big as Roman Empire. But he got the title of Roman Emperor. Again, it was the church's attempt to revive something that has not been revivable to this day, something that could not be revived. Charlemagne had his good points. When most men of his day were reckless in eating and drinking, he was temperate in both. You might say he kept his body in some kind of condition. He drank only a little bit. He ate just enough, but without overeating. His government system, though, was very inefficient. He governed from horseback. He had a palace, which he almost never went to, but he'd get on horseback and go to a place that needed his service. And he was surrounded all the time by counts. And he would tell this count, you go to this place, you go to that. And he tried to rule through the counts. But again, this was very inefficient. But he realized after a time that he would give an order to a count or to a messenger, and by the time the messenger got to the person to give the order to, the message might have changed several times. So, hey, I've got to learn how to write. And Charlemagne needed to be right. He said, I need a scribe with me who can write my orders down, and then I need to teach the nobility how to read. So he set up a school for the nobles only, to where the nobility, when they were boys, would learn how to read and write. And this was the beginning of public education in Europe. It was a small beginning, and it was only for the nobles, and it was so that the king's orders would be understood, because oftentimes the nobles say, hey, I thought you meant one thing, or I was told this. Him setting up a state school, basically it was a state-sponsored school, is believed by many to have eventually led to every king setting up his college. And by the 1300s, every king in Europe had a college. And this is believed to have been one of the reasons why Europe excelled, is because they got their masters of learning together in one place, in one location. They would exchange ideas and come up oftentimes with better ideas. And then these schools would exchange their knowledge with other schools. And the knowledge that they got together would be passed on that way from one generation to another and built upon with each generation. And supposedly Europe got better for it. Now, after Charlemagne, the empire was divided. Well, Charlemagne only had one son who survived. But then he divided his empire among his three sons. I mean, probably among his three grandsons. I mean, he had only one son, but that son had three sons. And the one kingdom became Germany. The other one became France in modern times. The other one disintegrated. Lothair, the oldest one, got the middle kingdom, which was between France and Germany, but it disintegrated. Lothair got North Italy, but that one did not work out. His brother's kingdoms eventually became Germany, one of them, and the other one became France. Now, during Charlemagne's time, a group of people began invading Europe, called the Vikings. The Vikings were from the land of Scandinavia, which I did mention in one of the past. Scandinavia is Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. Now, what made these Vikings want to move? We can't prove it, folk, but again, there are persons who believe that it was climate change. Climate change in reverse. Basically, that in the 800s or so, the climate in Norway and Sweden cooled down. And this forced some Vikings to decide that, hey, our farms will not support us anymore, so they began to move south, and they lived by stealing from Europeans who lived a bit farther south of plunder. Now, if you think this word Scandinavia looks like the word scandal, there is a connection there. A lot of people believed that the behavior of the Scandinavians was scandalous, so there is a connection. Scandinavia, the land of the scandals, land of scandal. Anyway, the Vikings, we do not know if they wore helmets with horns on the side. Well, this is one of the myths that sprung up out of them. We do know that their ships, so we have found a Viking ship, their ships were pointed on both ends, which meant that they could go in both directions. Where the Vikings and the Viking ships had a monster head on both sides. In other words, the Vikings could go upriver and then go back downriver without turning around. They would hang their shields on the side of their ships. And the Viking ships sent terror to you because all of a sudden these Europeans would see a ship with monster heads on each side. Now, the purpose of the monster heads, and the Vikings believed that there were sea monsters in the sea, including the great sea serpent. And the great sea serpent was the great sea serpent went all the way around the earth 2 times where its head touched its tail. But it went all the way around the earth, according to the story. And their god Thor battled the sea serpent a couple of times, but on the day of doom, or the day of Ragnarok, they believed it would come a day of doom, Thor was going to kill the sea serpent, but the sea serpent's poison would kill him. Now, have any of you heard these stories before, from other sources? Thor, there's been a lot of interest in Thor lately. For one thing, the Marvel comic books took him up and made a comic out of him. Yeah, one of you is nodding your head, you've heard that. And also, he's been in movies lately. There was a time in my house where we had a storm and a power. Somebody hit the pole in a power field. And my wife was down in Florida, and I was with 3 kids. And there was no air conditioning, so we got to go somewhere where there's air conditioning. So I said, let's go see a movie. So we went to see the movie entitled Thor. This was back a few years back. Thor appears in all your Avengers movies and in your Iron Man movies. Yeah, we know what I'm talking about. Okay, one of you at least. The rest of you got kind of blank. But anyway, Thor was one of the gods of the Vikings. The chief god was Odin. And the bad god was Loki. This was their religion. Their female god of love, was Frigga. All these pagans had a female goddess of love and beauty. Frigga was her name. Now, the names of our days of the week come from these Viking gods. Today is Wednesday. It's Odin's Day. Odin was also called Woden. Wednesday, Woden's Day. Thursday, Thor's Day, named after Thor. Frigga, Friday, named after the Viking goddess of love and beauty. Frigga, Friday. So the names, Tuesday named after Tur. Tur is the Viking god of courage and bravery. At one time the chief of the gods, but then he fell down in importance as time went on and Odin took over. Tur offered his hand to the enemy wolf, and the enemy wolf bit his hand off, so Tur is pictured as being a god with his right hand missing. Again, this was all part of this Vikings religion. Now, here's something else about the Vikings. Were they important in our history? And I'm out of time, but it is now proven fact the Vikings came to America 500 years before Columbus. We have found their colony in Nova Scotia. We have found their colonies in Greenland. But they came and settled, and we have found Viking artifacts as far west. And apparently they went down the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes and went as far west as Minnesota. But they were excellent seamen, and they crossed the seas. They were bold. But they were forced out of North America by the American Indians, who at that time were more powerful and more numerous than they were 500 years later. Also, 500 years later, the Europeans had guns, and kings got involved, and that meant armies and navies got involved, gunpowder and bigger ships than the Vikings had. But the Vikings did settle in Nova Scotia for 10 years. Then the Viking colonies in Greenland died out due to a hard freeze. Again, which is proof that the climate must have cooled about that time. All right, so much for that, everybody. Have a good weekend. We'll continue.